Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know, I love getting to explore these topics with you, and today we're taking a deep dive into something that, well, maybe isn't the most glamorous, but is definitely important. Infections of the urogenital tract.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at microbiology Q&A 23 urogenital system infections for this one. And I promise it's going to be surprisingly fascinating and maybe even some useful knowledge to have.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about both the urinary A and D reproductive systems, and they're more connected than you might think.
They really are. You know, we often think of those systems as totally separate.
Right.
But they're actually really closely linked, and that's where things can get, well, kind of interesting.
Or infected.
Yeah, exactly.
So to kick things off, can you give us a quick overview of just the urinary system? What's going on down there?
Sure. So think of your urinary system like a really efficient filtration plant.
Okay.
You've got your kidneys, which are the real workhorses. They're constantly filtering waste products from your blood and producing urine. And then that urine travels down these tubes called ureters to the bladder.
Okay.
Which is basically like a holding tank until you're ready to go.
Yeah. So far, so good. I think we all know what happens next. Gotta go, gotta go. But I'm guessing that's where things can get a little risky.
Exactly. The bladder itself and the urethra, which is the tube that carries urine out of the body.
Right.
Those are the most common places for infections to start. It's like a vulnerable entry point for all those microbes.
So let's talk about those microbes. Who are the usual suspects when it comes to these urinary tract infections?
Well, the number one culprit is bacteria.
Okay.
And a lot of the time it's E. coli.
E. coli.
Which is the bacteria that normally lives in our intestines, but sometimes it can kind of make a wrong turn and end up in the urinary tract. And that's when you get bacterial cystitis.
Bacterial cystitis.
Which most people know as a bladder infection.
Ugh, bladder infections. Not fun.
Not fun at all.
I've heard they're super common, especially for women.
Yeah, they are, and that's because of anatomy. The female urethra is shorter than the male urethra. Right. So it's easier for bacteria to travel up to the bladder. But anyone can get a UTI.
Right.
And sometimes they can actually become more serious.
That's what I was wondering. Are all UTIs the same? Or are some more worrisome than others?
Well, there's kind of a whole range of UTIs.
Yeah.
You know, simple bladder infection can usually be treated with antibiotics.
Yeah.
But if the infection spreads up to the kidneys, that's when we're talking about pyelonephritis.
Pyelonephritis. That sounds intense.
It is. It can cause fever chills, back pain. Yeah. And if it's not treated, it could even cause problems throughout the whole body.
So definitely don't want to ignore that one.
No, you don't.
Okay, so E. coli causing bladder infections, and it travels up. It can lead to pyelonephritis. Anything else we should be watching out for in the urinary system?
There's one more culprit that's a little more, well, unusual.
Oh.
It's called leptospirosis.
Which is spirosis?
And it could be pretty nasty. It's spread through contact with infected animal urine.
Okay.
Usually in contaminated water.
So like rat pee is puddles. Should I be worried about taking my dog to the park after it rains?
It's more common in tropical climates.
Okay.
But yeah, it's good to be aware of it.
Good to know. Okay, so we've talked about the bad guys in the urinary system. Now, what about the reproductive system? I feel like there are a lot of misconceptions about what can go wrong down there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's not just bacteria causing trouble either.
It's not?
Nope. You've got viruses, fungi, even protozoa.
Oh boy. This is getting complex.
Just a little bit.
Well, I'm ready to learn more. Let's start with viruses. Which ones are the biggest troublemakers when it comes to the reproductive system?
One of the most well-known is genital herpes.
Genital herpes, okay.
Which is usually caused by herpes simplex virus type 2, or HSV2 for short.
HSV2, got it.
But you might be surprised to learn that HSV1, which is the type that usually causes cold sores, can also sometimes be responsible for genital herpes.
So even the virus that gives us those annoying lip blisters can make its way elsewhere. And what's the deal with genital herpes? I know people talk about outbreaks and stuff.
Yeah, the tricky thing about genital herpes is that it can come back again and again.
So even after treatment, you can still have outbreaks?
It's possible, unfortunately.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, and there's another complication too.
What's that?
Neonatal herpes.
Neonatal herpes?
Yeah, so if a pregnant person with genital herpes gives birth, the virus can actually be transmitted to the baby.
Oh, wow.
Which can be really serious.
So that's something to definitely keep in mind.
Definitely.
Okay, so recurring outbreaks and potential risks during childbirth. Anything else to worry about in the virus department?
Oh, absolutely. Human papillomaviruses, or HPV.
HPV.
Those are actually the most common sexually transmitted viruses.
Wow, okay.
And there's so many different types of HPV.
Right.
Some types cause genital warts,
right,
while others are linked to cervical cancer.
Okay, so HPV is no joke. It seems like some viruses can be really subtle and then cause problems later on.
That's true. And that's why regular checkups and talking openly with your doctor are so important.
Makes sense.
They can help figure out your risk and recommend the right screening and prevention strategies for you.
Okay, good advice. All right, we've talked about bacteria and viruses. Now, what about fungi? Are those causing trouble in the urogenital tract too?
You bet. When we talk about fungal infections down there, we got to talk about Candida. Candida.
They're actually part of our normal microbiota. You know, they live on our skin, in our respiratory tract, and yes, even in the urogenital tract.
Hold on. So these fungi are just hanging out in there all the time?
Pretty much.
And then what? They just decide to cause problems? What's going on there?
Well, usually they're kept in check by the body's natural defenses.
Oh.
But things like changes in pH can disrupt the vaginal microbiota. And that can allow Candida to grow too much. And that's when you get a yeast infection.
Ah, so it's all about balance.
Exactly. Just like with the gut bacteria, we hear so much about too much of a good thing can turn into a bad thing.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance down there. And keeping things in check is super important for urogenital health.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got bacteria, viruses, fungi. What about protozoa? Are those tiny creatures also something to worry about in the urogenital tract?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's Trichomonas vaginalis.
Trichomonas vaginalis.
That's okay. It's a common protozoan that can cause trichomoniasis.
And that is?
A sexually transmitted infection.
Gotcha. And is it always causing problems?
Not necessarily. Like Candida, it can actually be present in small amounts in the normal microbiota without causing any symptoms.
So sometimes it's there and it's fine, and sometimes it's not. That seems kind of tricky.
It can be. Trichomoniasis is often asymptomatic.
Meaning?
People can have it and not even know it.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah. But when there are symptoms,
okay,
they can include things like discomfort when you pee, irritation, itching, and discharge. Got it. So we've got this whole cast of microscopic characters causing a range of infections in both the urinary and reproductive systems. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, even protozoa. It's like a whole world down there.
It really is. And it's important to understand these different types of infections because they have different consequences and need to be treated differently.
So speaking of treatment, how do doctors figure out what's causing these infections?
Well, for UTIs, a key tool is urinalysis.
Urinalysis?
Yeah, it can detect things like white blood cells and bacteria in the urine,
okay,
which can indicate an infection.
Makes sense. And for reproductive tract infections?
There are different tests like swabs or blood tests.
Got it. So they're looking for clues to figure out who the culprit is?
Yeah.
And then what? Antibiotics for everything?
Not quite. For bacterial infections, broad-spectrum antibiotics are often the first choice.
What does that mean?
They target a wide range of bacteria, which is helpful when you don't know exactly what's causing the infection.
So kind of like a catch-all. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But for viral and fungal infections, antibiotics won't work.
Right, because those are totally different.
Exactly. Those need different approaches.
Like what?
Well, for example, yeast infections are usually treated with antifungal medications.
Okay.
Like fluconazole.
Fluconazole?
Which target the overgrowth of Candida.
Makes sense. And what about trichomoniasis?
That's usually treated with a type of drug called an antiflagellate.
Okay.
Like metronidazole.
Metronidazole, all right.
It targets the Trichomonas vaginalis parasite specifically.
Wow. So there's a whole arsenal of treatments depending on what kind of infection it is. That's good to know.
It is.
Yeah.
And there's been so much progress in developing these treatments.
Yeah.
But it's still really important to get diagnosed early and get the right care to prevent things from getting worse.
All right, before we move on, let's recap what we've learned about urogenital infections. We talked about the urinary system and how bacteria like E. coli can cause bladder infection, which, if they're not treated, can lead to a more serious kidney infection called pyelonephritis. We also learned about leptospirosis, that infection you can get from contaminated water, often from animal urine.
Yeah.
And then we explored the reproductive system and all the different types of microbes that can cause problems there. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, even protozoa.
That's right. It's not just bacteria down there.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a whole lot that can impact urogenital health.
There is.
But the good news is there are effective treatments for most of these infections.
Yeah, for sure.
We just need to be aware to take precautions and seek help when we need it.
Absolutely.
Now, there's one more category of urogenital infections we need to discuss,
Okay.
and that's sexually transmitted infections, or STIs.
All right.
We'll be diving into those in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
I will.
Welcome back to our deep dive on urogenital infections. We've already covered a lot of ground talking about the urinary and reproductive systems and all the different microbes that can cause infections in those areas. But now I want to focus on a category of infections that I think carries a lot of stigma, sexually transmitted infections, or STIs.
Yeah, you're right. There's so much secrecy and shame around STIs.
Right.
Which is why it's so important to talk about them openly and honestly.
Absolutely. So let's just start with the basics. How do people even know if they have an STI?
That's a great question. And it's tricky because a lot of STIs can be asymptomatic.
Asymptomatic?
Meaning you don't have any symptoms.
Oh, so you could have an STI and not even know it.
Exactly. And that's why regular STI screening is so important.
Okay, so it's not just about getting tested if you have symptoms.
Right. It's about being proactive about your sexual health.
So it's like a regular checkup, but for your, well, you know.
Pretty much. It's like preventative maintenance.
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
You know, organizations like the CDC recommend routine STI testing, especially if you're sexually active with new or multiple partners.
Makes sense.
That way you can catch infections early, even when there aren't any symptoms.
So early detection is key.
Absolutely. Yeah. It means you can get treated sooner and prevent spreading the infection to others.
So what kinds of tests are we talking about here? What are doctors looking for?
Well, there are a few different types of tests, each with its own pros and cons. One common one is the nucleic acid amplification test, or NATE.
NATE, okay.
Yeah, these tests are super sensitive, and they can actually detect the genetic material of specific pathogens, like the DNA of a bacterium or the RNA of a virus.
So they're basically looking for the unique fingerprint of the infection.
Exactly. NATEs are often used to diagnose chlamydia and gonorrhea, which are two really common STIs. Then there are serological tests.
Serological tests, those sound familiar.
Yeah, they look for antibodies that your body produces in response to an infection.
So it's like your immune system is raising a flag and saying, hey, there's something wrong here.
That's a great way to think about it. Serological tests are often used to diagnose syphilis and HIV.
Okay, and what was the last type of test?
Oh, right. Cultures.
Culture.
Which involve taking a sample and seeing if the pathogen can grow in a lab.
So they're basically trying to grow the infection in a petri dish.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like planting a seed and seeing if it sprouts.
Interesting. So there are a lot of different options, but how do you know which test is the right one?
That's a question for your doctor. They'll consider your risk factors, sexual history, any symptoms you might have, and then recommend the most appropriate tests.
Okay, so let's say someone gets tested and finds out they do have an STI. What happens next?
Well, the treatment really depends on which STI it is.
Okay.
For bacterial STIs, like chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, antibiotics are the usual treatment.
Okay, so antibiotics can take care of those.
Yeah, they work great for bacterial infections. But what about viral STIs?
Yeah, I've heard those can be trickier.
They can be. For viral STIs like herpes, there's no cure.
Oh, no.
But there are antiviral medications that can help manage the symptoms and reduce how often you have outbreaks.
So it's about keeping the virus under control.
Exactly. Kind of like pruning a plant to keep it from getting too big.
What about HPV? Any treatments for that?
For HPV itself, there's no cure.
Okay.
But there are treatments for genital warts.
Oh, right.
And even more importantly, there's a vaccine for HPV.
Wait, a vaccine? For an STI?
Yeah. It can protect against some strains of HPV.
Wow. So you can actually prevent the infection altogether.
Yep. The HPV vaccine is amazing when it comes to preventing HPV infection and reducing the risk of cervical cancer.
That's huge. So we've got testing, treatment, even vaccination in our arsenal against STIs. But there's one more thing I want to talk about.
Okay, what's that?
Disclosure. If someone is diagnosed with an STI, should they tell their partner?
That's a really important question. And it gets at the ethical responsibility we have to protect ourselves and others.
Right.
It can be a really tough conversation.
Yeah, I bet.
But disclosing an STI to your partner is crucial for preventing the spread of infection.
It's about breaking the chain of transmission, right?
Exactly. So they can get tested and treated if necessary.
And it's just about open communication in any relationship.
Absolutely. It's about respect, honesty, and building trust.
I totally agree. Honesty is always the best policy. But what about the legal side of things? Are there laws about not disclosing an STI?
That can get a little complicated.
Right.
Laws are different in each state.
Okay.
But in a lot of places, it's actually illegal to knowingly transmit an STI without telling your partner.
So it's not just an ethical issue, it's also a legal one?
In many cases, yes.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on STIs, from the different types of infections to testing treatment and even the ethical and legal considerations of disclosure. Is there anything else we should touch on?
I think it's just important to remember that anyone can get an STI.
Right. It doesn't discriminate.
Exactly. No matter your age, gender, sexual orientation, or relationship status. And there's still so much stigma around STIs.
Yeah.
Which can make it hard for people to talk about them, get tested, seek treatment.
Absolutely. People can be so judgmental.
It's true. And that creates a lot of shame and fear.
For sure. What we need is more open and accepting conversations about sexual health.
I completely agree. We need to replace judgment with compassion and understanding.
I couldn't agree more. It's not about blame. It's about taking care of ourselves and each other.
Exactly.
Knowledge, open communication, regular testing, those are the best tools we have.
I think so, too.
All right, so let's take a moment to think about everything we've learned about STIs. They can be complex, they're often silent, and they can have serious consequences if they're not treated. But with the right information, open communication, and access to healthcare, we can handle these challenges responsibly.
And protect ourselves and our partners.
Exactly. It's about taking charge of our sexual health and creating a world where STIs aren't something to be ashamed of.
That's the goal.
We've covered a lot of ground talking about urogenital infections.
We really have.
Everything from that super efficient filtration plant that is the urinary system to the delicate ecosystem of the reproductive tract. It's amazing how much is happening in those parts of our bodies, you know?
It really is.
Yeah.
And we often take them for granted until something goes wrong.
Exactly. So before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we've connected all the dots.
Okay.
We started by exploring those common bacterial infections, like the ones caused by E. coli, which can lead to bladder infections or cystitis.
Yeah.
And then we talked about how those infections can sometimes turn into something more serious.
Right, like pyelonephritis, which affects the kidneys.
Yeah, and we can't forget about leptospirosis.
Oh yeah, the one you can get from contaminated water.
Often from animal urine. It's kind of a reminder that even our everyday surroundings can be risky for our urogenital health. Then we moved on to the reproductive system, where we encountered a whole bunch of different microbes.
Bacteria, viruses, fungi, even protozoa.
It's like a whole world down there. We talked about the challenges of recurring outbreaks with genital herpes.
Right.
And the potential long-term consequences of HPV.
And let's not forget about the vaginal microbiota and how important that balance is.
Yeah, disruptions can lead to those pesky yeast infections.
And then, of course, we talked about STIs.
Which are so important to understand.
Absolutely. Well, especially the importance of regular testing and open communication with partners.
And knowing the ethical and legal stuff around disclosure.
Right. All of that is crucial.
It's been a lot of information, but I think the biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power when it comes to urogenital health.
I agree with that. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make good decisions about your health.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about personal responsibility.
It's about public health, too.
Right. So what can we do on a larger scale to address these issues?
Well, we need to be promoting comprehensive sex education, for one thing.
That makes sense.
And increasing access to affordable testing and treatment.
Yeah. Everyone should be able to get the care they need.
Absolutely.
And, of course, we need to keep challenging the stigma around STIs.
It's so important to create a space where people feel comfortable talking about their sexual health.
I agree. It's about building a society where people feel empowered rather than ashamed.
I love that. Openness and understanding instead of judgment and fear.
Exactly. We all have a part to play in promoting urogenital health, both for ourselves and for our communities.
Well, this deep dive has given me a lot to think about. Who knew a single microbiology textbook could be so eye-opening?
It's pretty amazing how much we can learn from just one resource.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's made you curious to learn more.
And to take charge of your own well-being.
Exactly. You're not alone in this journey either.
There's so much support out there, from healthcare providers to online communities. It's all about finding what works for you. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of urogenital infections.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you learned something new about these amazing complex systems that keep us going.
Stay curious and keep learning.
Until next time.